I want to start with an image. A t-shirt. You've seen it. Everyone has. A young man's face in red and black, beret, beard, eyes lifted towards some distant horizon. You've seen it on college campuses, on musicians, on anti-establishment posters, on products sold in shopping malls owned by billion-dollar corporations. The face belongs to Ernesto Che Guevara, and almost nobody wearing it knows who he actually was, what he wrote, who he defended, what he believed, what he helped build. So today, instead of asking historians, journalists, or activists, we're going to ask him. Che, welcome to Coffee with Giants.
Joshua, for 60 years I have watched people wear my face. Students, actors, children of the bourgeoisie. Most of them have never held a rifle, never slept hungry, never crossed a jungle with infection in their lungs, never watched men die for an idea. And yet, they wore the uniform of revolution as fashion. Sometimes I wonder whether my death was simply converted into merchandise.
The people wearing your face today think you stood for justice, for liberation, for the oppressed. Is that what you stood for?
I stood for revolution. That is not the same thing. Justice is a word comfortable people use to feel morally elevated. Revolution is what happens when a society reaches the point where speech no longer changes anything. The modern boy wearing my shirts believes in expression, discussion, awareness. In Sierra Maestra, in 1957, I would have asked him a simpler question. What are you willing to die for? And if the answer was weak, I would have moved on.
It's interesting to hear you say that, because the boy at the university you're describing, comfortable, well-read, raised with books and without hunger, that was you. You were born into the Argentine aristocracy, a descendant of a Spanish viceroy. You never went hungry until you chose to. So when you despise him, you're despising where you started.
Correct. And that is precisely why I have the authority to despise it. I know exactly what that comfort is worth, because I left it. The difference between us is not birth, Joshua. It is that I was willing to abandon mine. You do not understand revolution if you imagine it is conducted through sympathetic conversation. A revolutionary movement survives because some men are willing to do what others are too civilized to do, including against comrades who become liabilities. History is not changed by consensus. It is changed by disciplined minorities willing to impose direction.
There's a quote of yours people try very hard not to talk about anymore. You wrote, "Hatred is an element of the struggle. Relentless hatred of the enemy that impels us over and beyond the natural limitations of man and transforms us into effective, violent, selective, and cold killing machines." You wrote that in 1967.
Yes, and I meant it. The young people wearing my face prefer the romantic version of me, the doctor, the dreamer, the rebel photographed beneath the sun. They do not like hearing that hatred has utility. Without hatred, the old order survives indefinitely. With hatred, disciplined, directed, controlled, the impossible becomes operational.
Operational. That's also the language people use about your executions.
At La Cabaña, in 1959, I oversaw military tribunals, officers of Batista's regime, collaborators, torturers. Some trials lasted hours, some minutes, and yes, men were executed. Modern people find this horrifying because they encounter violence only through screens. Batista's police torture people for years, murder students, terrorize entire neighborhoods. But when the revolution answered violence with violence, suddenly procedure became sacred. I would do it again. Revolutions that hesitate die quickly.
How many people were executed under your authority?
Enough for the revolution to survive its infancy. History is not preserved by sentimentality.
I want to move to something else. Because many people wearing your shirt today believe you represented anti-racism and liberation. But in 1952, travelling through Venezuela, you wrote something about black people in Caracas. You were 24.
I remember it. I wrote that black people had maintained their racial purity through their lack of affinity with bathing. I wrote that the black is indolent and a dreamer, while Europeans carried a tradition of work and saving. Yes, I wrote it.
You remember it word for word.
I have read my own diaries, Joshua. And modern people desperately want this to be merely the ignorance of youth. Perhaps the vocabulary changed, but my judgment about discipline did not. In the Congo, in 1965, I commanded black soldiers in their own revolutionary struggle, and I wrote in my campaign journal that they did not know how to handle their weapons and did not want to learn. That was not a confused boy of 24 writing in a travel diary. That was a 40-year-old commander. People want redemption arcs. History rarely provides them.
So you don't disavow those writings?
I do not perform repentance for modern audiences. Modern morality changes every 6 months. What I observed, I observed. What I believed about revolutionary discipline, I believed. The young man on your campus wearing my shirt would not survive a month in the conditions I lived under for years. He should not quote me. He should be embarrassed too.
I want to ask about 1960, the labour camp you organised.
Guanacabibes. It was a term for those considered incompatible with revolutionary discipline. Men unwilling to work, men unwilling to commit themselves fully to the revolutionary project. The revolution was not simply changing institutions. It was creating what I call the new man. And the new man would not be formed through comfort.
And the women? Did they fight as equals?
In Guerrilla Warfare, my own manual, 1961, I wrote that women were capable of every task a man could perform. I believed it. And then I wrote what those tasks were. The woman cooks, it improves morale, and she is easier to keep in domestic work. She sews the uniforms. She carries the messages beneath her skirt. She teaches the men to read. A woman carrying a rifle into combat, a rare accident of guerrilla life. That is what I wrote, in my own hand. The girl wearing my face and calling me a feminist has not read a single page of it.
The new man had a place for women. A narrow one, but a place. What about the men who didn't fit the mould at all?
Ah, you mean the homosexuals? Yes. The new man we were building had no room for that kind of softness. It was treated as bourgeois decadence, a sickness imported from capitalist culture. And the cure, as always, was labor. That is why we created the camp at Guanacabibes. And later, after I left Cuba, that logic expanded into the UMAP camps. Political undesirables, religious dissidents, the same men by the thousands. The modern admirer wearing my face knows none of this. He knows the photograph.
Most of them have no idea.
That is what I find contemptible. Ignorance. If they read what I actually wrote, they would be forced into a choice. Either become genuine revolutionaries, which most are incapable of, or stop wearing the shirt. And let us be honest about most of them. Soft, distracted, living for comfort and their own small pleasures. The boy on your campus wearing my face? I would have sent him to Guanacabibes to be reforged. He would have thanked me later if he survived the work.
Che, listening to you, something becomes very clear. You believed all of it. The executions, the camps, hatred as a political tool. The idea that people could be reshaped through pressure and force. You are not hiding from any of it. You think you were right.
Within the system I accepted, I was consistent. That is more than most men can say.
And I think that's exactly what makes this dangerous. You reduced human beings into categories inside a system. And once that happens, compassion becomes negotiable. The individual becomes secondary to the project. The moment the ideology becomes more sacred than the human being, people become obstacles.
You are beginning to understand revolution.
Yes, I believe I am. The revolution stopped serving human beings, and human beings began serving the revolution. And once that inversion happens, almost anything becomes justifiable.
Yes, I have had 60 years to reconsider my life. And I have not changed my conclusions.
I know, that's the point. This is obviously a giant fails episode. And the failure isn't that Che was secretly a bad man, it's that he meant every word. So don't worship symbols, read them first, then decide if you still want to wear the shirt. And next time we're talking with Aragorn about what it actually means to be a man. Which means we'll probably learn more about masculinity from a fictional character than from a real one on a t-shirt. See you then.